Again, that sound came.
No, I lifted the
Shruti.
microphone. That's why I put it down.
But there's still a buzzing sound.
Is it so for everyone?
I got it just now, but now I'm not getting it.
Yeah, now because she's muted herself.
Oh,
Still?
unmute.
Now?
No, I'm not getting. Yeah, little bit is there. Yeah, light sound is there.
Is it still there?
Yep. I think if you don't use your earphones, it may be better.
I'll try that.
Can't hear you, Shruti.
No, we can't hear you. You need to increase the volume on your laptop or whatever.
No, it's not reading my system speaker, so I'll have to plug in my earphones. I think we can begin.
Yes, it's 3:32.
Yes. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, to our discussion today on the role of assessment in learning. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to quickly go through some house rules. Requesting all participants to please stay on mute during the webinar. Please do keep your videos, at least the participants, you all can decide if your videos on or off depending on the bandwidth. We would prefer if you can have your videos on. Kindly share your suggestions and feedback in the chat box. When you're sharing your feedback and suggestions in the chat box, please do mention your name along with your organization. Uh, Also, we will be taking up the questions, the Q&A at the last 10 to 15 minutes. So in the meantime, you can, if you have any questions, you can feel free to share it in the chat box when the webinar is going on. Welcome everybody once again. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being part of today's webinar. And I think that it is a very special day for us today because it is our founder, Mrs. Elizabeth Mehta's birthday today. So we wish you a very, very happy birthday, Liz ma'am. And I think it's so special because this topic is also very, very close to her heart. And I don't think there could have been a better day for us to be discussing the role of assessments in learning. Before we delve deeper into the topic, I would like to share a little bit about Muktangan. We are a unique community-owned educational project primarily based in Mumbai's G South ward, where we offer child-friendly, inclusive and holistic education, leveraging the potential of the community. We continue to impact more than 4,000 children from educationally underserved communities year on year. More than 900 community members have been developed and placed through our teacher training programs. And we've been able to reach out to more than 75,000 children and 5,000 teachers and teacher educators through our outreach projects. So today we are here. I'm sorry about that. There was a bit of a technical glitch. So today we are here to talk about what is assessment and how can we enhance the quality of assessments to nurture the overall health of the education system. It gives me great happiness to introduce our speakers for today. I'd like to share my screen. Is this visible to everyone?
Yes.
Yes, Shruti.
All right. Passionate about education, Ms.Nita has worked for over 12 years at a prestigious international school in Mumbai and has held senior leadership positions across all grades. She has led workshops for other educators in the use of technology in education, assessment, sketchnoting, and literacy instruction. She also consults with edtech companies in the area of content creation and curriculum development. As an assessor for Adhyayan, she has taken part in school reviews all over India. Determined to give back to society, she has switched careers and joined Adhyayan Quality Education Foundation as a director and looks after people practices. We welcome you, Ms. Nita. We have Ms. Kinnari Pandya, an associate professor at Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. She coordinates the four-year integrated teacher education BSc B.Ed program offered by the university and teaches courses in human development and early childhood education. She has been involved in conceptualization and implementation of early childhood education efforts of the foundation, the specialization offered in the MA in Education program at the Azim Premji University, and field initiatives of the foundation in several states, Telangana, Karnataka, and Madhya Pradesh, to name a few. She has contributed to several public education system improvement initiatives of the Azim Premji Foundation since 2006. She has been involved as a member in technical committees on the ECCE by Government of Karnataka for ECCE curriculum and teacher capacity development. She is a member of the National Council of Teacher Education from March 2020 and contributes to NCERT's work on early childhood care and education. She regularly writes on issues of early years and teacher education as well. Thank you so much, Ms. Kinnari, for joining us. Ms.Vinita Sanghi, a chartered accountant by degree but a teacher by passion. She worked as a chartered accountant for 5 years and then followed her passion, volunteering at Akanksha for 3 years. She joined Muktangan in 2008 and has never looked back since then. Ms. Vinita is currently the leader of the In-Service Teacher Education Department in Muktangan. Welcome, Ms. Vinita. I now invite our facilitator, Ms.Jumana Rampurawala, Chief Program Officer at Muktangan, to kindly take this discussion forward.
Thank you, Shruti, for the introductions, and good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to each and every one of you for the webinar on assessments for learning. And I once again welcome our esteemed speakers, Ms.Nita, Ms.Kinnari, and Vinita. Well, assessments is a word which I think is something that's always going on, and we keep talking about it. And therefore, when Muktangan thought of doing a webinar, we said, let's hear what, around everyone around us is thinking about assessments, talking about assessments, and, deconstruct this word assessments, especially now with we are in the post-COVID stage. Pre-COVID also it was there, and during COVID it had a different structure to it, and now post-COVID, a lot of learning loss, everyone's talking about it. So what is it going to be? Is it going to be a lot of assessments to see what is the learning loss, or is it going to be backward? So let's hear today, without wasting any more time. Let's move on to the crux of the issue here, and we'll begin by asking all our speakers, what according to them assessment is, and why do they think it's important, whether it was pre-COVID or post-COVID or in any
Are
which
we
way.
doing the poll on assessment, the word assessment?
So, yeah, Vinita, over to you if you would like to.
Yeah, so I'll
take
just
that
share my
first.
screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have
So-
pasted this link in the chat box for our participants.
Yeah, so I think let's just let's start with, what word comes to mind when we hear the word assessment, and let's get some audience participation into what your thoughts are. I think every participant will be allowed about 3 words that they associate with assessment. So go ahead.
So, Vinita, you want the participants to click on the link and fill in 3 words?
Yeah.
How do you want to do this?
Yeah. They have to click on the link, fill in the 3 words and submit. It doesn't have to be 3, it can be 1 or 2 also.
Great. So the link has been given in the chat. We request the participants to, just click on the link, and what do they think, or what word comes to their mind when we hear the word assessment? Yeah.
Just give me a second. Yeah, so I think we can all see the words coming. Right. What I don't understand. Interesting. Checking what I know, developmental, exams, tests. Yeah. Problem. Interesting words coming out. Okay. Progress is being highlighted, which means many people are, that's what they are saying, because that kind of gets highlighted as there are more people sharing the same word that gets highlighted. So interesting. Are we having some more coming through? Where the child is. Checking what I know. Yeah, reflection. Exams. What I don't understand. Logic building, thought process. Okay. Interesting to see what everyone thinks assessment is all about first. So we thought this would be a good way to start. Let's get a start on what, what is like that comes to your mind immediately when you hear the word assessment. And I think it's pretty clear over here for everyone to see that it's kind of related with a little bit of stress as well, when we look at exams, tests, what I don't understand, monitoring my learning. So anyway, okay, we have more coming through. Yeah. Yeah, I like that, ongoing. Okay, thanks. I think we can stop there. Should we?
Yes, I think, Vinita,
Yeah.
if we could hear from you also, what, according to you, is assessment and why do you think it's important?
Yeah.
And then we can move on to Kinnari and Nita. Yeah.
Right. So, of course, we are all doing assessments every day, talking about it and all of that. But why do we need assessment? So there's this cartoon that really just clicked with me on why we need assessment. It's like, I taught him, I didn't say he learned it. So if there's anything sort of teaching going on in the classroom, it doesn't mean that it is always learned. Children learn at their own levels, with their own capacities, with their own experiences that they have, and that gives them a different perspective on things than what the teacher may think just that one way. So I think that's why we need to assess where our children are. If it just happened automatically, I don't think we would be here talking about this today. But of course, we understand the individual needs of all children, and therefore, I think assessment is required. I also think assessment is required because ultimately what we are trying to do is build skills in our children. It's not only for school and the knowledge and understanding that they get there, but to equip them for life later. And any skill that is taught in school should be a transferable skill, something that they can use even later on. So we are even assessing for the skills that we teach, which is communication, critical thinking, problem solving, of course, confidence, collaboration, and creativity. So yes. I think that is what why I think assessment is required, so that, you know, we give all our children a fair chance and to see where they are and help them in their own ways, in their own journeys. So
great.
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Vinita, for opening up with such great thoughts about assessment and why it's important. And we'll now move to Kinnari, if I may. What, according to you, is assessments, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so to me, assessment is a process of understanding and knowing where a child is, like many of you said on the poll. As adults, we are there is a responsibility, so to say, to see where the child is and enable the child to move forward, right? Many of us wrote progress as a key to know what assessment is and how assessment can lead to progress in a child. So assessing as several assessment as a judgment that you make about a child, and assessment methods that will help us make that judgment, right? So when we talk of educational assessment, we are also talking about several kinds of strategies that we use to know, to judge a capability, to judge a skill, to know where a child or an individual is. So to me, that's what is at the core of assessment. The process itself is significant when we talk of young children, and the idea of knowing where a child is, right, is at the core of assessment as the objective of assessment again. Yeah.
Thank you, Kinnari. So Kinnari has very well explained us that, why assessment is important, that it's important because we want to know where the child is, and to make judgments on children's progress or learning, it has to be through the different assessment ways and strategies that we know where the child is and essentially the progress that the child is making. So over to you, Nita, if we could hear you and your thoughts on the word assessment and why you think it's important.
Thanks, Jumana, and thank you, Vinita and Kinnari, for sharing. Often when you're defining something, it's also good to know what it's not. That helps you clarify concepts. So according to me, assessment is not a test, not meant to trip you up and find out what you don't know, which is what a lot of assessors want to do.
Absolutely.
It is not a final judgment on you. And it is not a measure of your intelligence. I like this definition by Patrick Griffiths, that assessment is actually the search for evidence of learning. Assessment helps us grow, identify any gaps, misconceptions, as you already said, and it ought to be developmental and not judgmental. We use assessments to figure out what we don't know, and then improve our knowledge on that basis. That's, according to me, what the purpose and what the word assessment means.
Thank you, Nita. Anything else that anyone wants to add? Vinita, Kinnari, anything, or we can move ahead? Yes, it's great that Nita has helped us understand what assessment is not. It's definitely not a test or an exam. And I like the way you said that it's developmental, and that's the spirit with which each educator needs to look at assessment when we look at it. And so moving on to our next question, we'll hear from Ms.Vinita, if we can, on what is it that then we are assessing, if it's developmental, and how are we assessing? And if Vinita could give us some examples for the same of what is it in today's scenario that what is it that we are looking at, and how is it that we should be looking at? So if Vinita, you could throw some light on what is it that we are assessing and how we assess.
Yeah. Thanks, Jumana. And thank you, Kinnari and Nita. That was, very interesting. Obviously, all of us are looking at trying to fill in those gaps. And I like the development and not judgmental, but unfortunately, sometimes that's what happens. So to go over to the question of what are we assessing and how, I'm of course going to share my experiences at Muktangan, because that's where I have gained all the experience that I have. And I will be presenting a PPT, and all the presentation is from the angle of social studies, because I have the pictures and everything of that. But of course, it applies to any other subject that we do. So what are we actually assessing? So we are assessing, obviously, understanding of concepts, application of concepts, and the skills and their transferability. Like I said, any skill learned should be transferable, and not only for that one particular unit, that skill. And we spoke about the 21st century skills as well, that ultimately this is what we want for our children to go ahead, to be critical thinkers, problem solvers, good communicators, be confident, collaborate well, because without collaboration, I don't think we can achieve anything. And creativity is obviously at the center of it all, because we're always looking for creative solutions for things. So the one question is also, when you're doing an assessment, it also comes that, who are we assessing for? So I guess based on that, we have three major types of assessment processes. One is which we have for the system. So if we are assessing for the system, that's a different kind of assessment, and that we call assessment of learning, because it kind of stops there. There's no loop. It's a one-way street. Then we have for the teachers, what we spoke about. If we want to know where the child is, if we want to know where the gaps are, we want to help the children to move along. If we said it's developmental, then it's for the teachers to take a call, and that is assessment for learning. And obviously that indicates a loop, because it goes from the teachers to the students, back to the teachers, to develop, move on, change experiences, and do that. And the last is for the children themselves. So for the children themselves to know where they are, and themselves decide how it is that they want to take their learning forward. And that is what we call assessment as or is learning. So these are the three types of assessment, and this is based on who the audience is. Is it the system? Then it's very clear, okay, we have those exams and all, that's for the system. That's something we have to do, but that's not the only thing. We need to look at what is in our hands, and that is the teachers and the students, which is assessment for learning and assessment as or is learning. So if this is what we want to do, then how are we assessing? So there are 3 steps of purposeful assessment. I think it was very important to go through the construct, as in what is it that we want to assess? What is that specific knowledge, skill, or understanding? As an assessor, we need to be clear exactly what we want to assess, and that needs to be communicated to the student as well. You can't show the student a flask and take it away and then what size was it? It's like, oh, I was looking at the color. You didn't tell me. I would have to gauge the size of that. So specifying the objective of the assessment, very important. The end use. What do we want to do with this? Again, is it for the system? Is it off learning? Is it for learning? Is it for the students themselves? What do we want to do with this information that we're going to get in the end? Are we going to make it a loop? Are we going to use it to change the experiences that then we provide to our children? Are we going to just leave it at that? So the end use. And of course, then the best tool. What and when is the most appropriate and effective way to assess in this instance? So whatever assessment tool we are using, we need to see that it applies to that particular position. So of course, assessment is something that needs to be defined by those who want to create the assessment. These are things, and clarity needs to be there about the objective. What am I going to do with the information I get? Because nowadays, it's just a lot about data collection, and a lot of data is collected. But after that, what? So what is going to be the end use? And again, is it the best tool for all the children, to assess all the children in the same way? Or do I want to have different tools, based on their different abilities? So what are the requisites of a good assessment? Is, by the acronym SMART, it should be specific, it should be achievable. Like Nita said, what should it not be? It's not something that you're trying to fox your learner and, challenge them and say, oh, let me see if you can do this. It is achievable by them. Of course, timely, measurable, and realistic. Realistic based in your context. You've got to look at your own children, see where they are, and therefore all children will be different. So the acronym SMART, I think, kind of sums up the requisites of a good assessment, and that is what it should be. I'm just going to take you through a brief glimpse of formative assessment, for learning and as learning, that we do in Muktangan. So active constructivism is something that we use in our classroom. It's a common thread that goes through all our subjects and all our curriculum and everything in Muktangan. But we also use this in assessment. Your assessment also should be engaging. It should also give the students something to explore, something to explain, elaborate, and the students themselves then can reflect. So here we have some for learning and as learning going on. So constructivism is not only in the classroom to explain a concept, it is also your assessment itself should have the 5 components of this, because you don't want to do, oh, I've done this question in the classroom, now that's what I'm going to assess in the paper, and that's what I'm going to mark them on. It should be something that they still get to investigate and explore. So I think that is one thing of assessment. We also use the 3 principles of learning in assessment. For example, the assessment, when you're setting an assessment, we're always going from simple to complex. You don't want to start with the most complex question first. You won't start with, why do you think the sky is blue? It'll be like, what is the color of the sky? How do you see it? And you build it up, and then you ultimately go to the last. So how do we do this simple to complex? Is, of course, using Bloom's taxonomy, because that helps us to understand that we are building up the questions one by one and then going to that. So simple to complex. Then there is concrete to abstract also in assessment, where they explore through concrete objects and they explain, they use different objects, and that's how the assessment is done. Of course, the reading, writing, and all of that is always done, so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the other unique ways that we assess in Muktangan. Known to unknown, again, exploring maps, I know I get chips, but where does it come from? Actually backtracking that journey. I know what my house looks like, but putting it in a map puts it into perspective. So known to unknown. So even using these 3 principles of learning in assessment. Then, of course, we have a lot of presentations. which help to build confidence, communication. These are the skills. A lot of diagrams. So it's not only that we need to do the reading, the writing, the questions, that happens as well. But, diagrams to show what they've learned. So for visual learners, it's very important. If visually they can tell you what they're seeing, what they understand, it's a very good way. And of course, skill building, I have not mentioned all the skills here, but I'm sure everyone can tell there's a lot of, I think, all the skills being developed through these diagrams itself. Again, like we spoke about the concrete to abstract, they're using concrete objects and exploring and explaining things. Using flashcards. There's a lot of the flashcards standing in place, even for kinesthetic learners, moving around, explaining things, arranging, say, layers of the atmosphere in order, doing the pressure belts, everything. So using flashcards and, creating that kind of assessment using this. Role plays, we have a lot of songs which take you from the known to the unknown, and simple, abstract concepts are explained through that. So even the songs, the singing, all of that also is used for assessment, where children, we make one verse, then the children will make their own verse and then express what they want to say through song, through role plays. So that's another way of assessing. Of course, constructing, exploring maps. Like you can see, this child is actually stepping onto the map and exploring which direction he's going in, where he is, how will he go from one place to the other, and actually getting onto that. So there's something for, for all the kinds of learners that we have. Of course, there's individual work. There's think, pair, and share, small groups, again, for collaboration and all of that. So those skills, and giving different types of, assessments. So children work with each other as well as individually. And this is an example of a differentiated assessment. If we have children at 3 different levels, it's just the outcome is a bit, like one will identify name, explain location of something. One will only identify name. And the last group will identify a name using a model or using something else. So it's also differentiated assessment at different levels. So the children move ahead from where they are. It's not one size fits all. So a lot of care is taken to even differentiated assessment in Muktangan. So I think ultimately we want to say assessment is the engine which drives student learning, and assessment is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instruction. So I think I'll sum up by saying that. So thank you, everyone. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, Vinita. Thank you so much. And there was so much packed into your presentation. And there were so many ideas coming out regarding assessment, and you very well brought out how assessment is tied up with pedagogy. In fact, it's almost, we couldn't make out. So assessment is almost learning. And the way you also explained to us how, different stakeholders, the different kinds of assessments are important, of course, for our students learning and, getting the skills. I'm sure you've brought out very well how we can go, simple to complex, concrete to abstract, and from known to unknown. And while the child is learning, the child is also assessing. And you gave very nice, very tangible takeaways for assessment. Like when a child is presenting something, a diagram, and explaining it, you can assess. You explained how a child explores, discovers something, and you get to know, and learning is happening at the same time assessment is happening. You also explain how, presentations and a very great example of differentiated assessment, where we want to have like learning is designed for different kinds of learners, different levels of learners, but at the same time, even the assessment should then be according to that, so that as Nita also very rightly said, that we don't want a child to get the feeling that, oh, this I don't know, and this is something that I'm being judged upon. So thank you so much. And of course, not forgetting that assessments designed need to be smart. So every time we think of assessments, we need to think of the word smart, that are they smart. Thank you so much, Vinita. Now we've got a fair idea of what assessment is, why is it important, and Vinita has very well explained to us what are some of the ways we can assess and how we can assess as a part of learning. Let's move on to our next speaker, Ms. Kinnari, who's worked a lot in the early childhood field. And I know most of the things that you've said do apply even to early childhood learners. But let's hear from our expert what assessment in the early childhood means, and get her views on how we can make it, really worthwhile for a child who's in that age where, concepts are just developing, and, the child is in that foundational stage. So over to you, Kinnari, if you can throw some light upon what are some of the assessment strategies, or how do we assess early childhood learners, or, young learners. Yes, Kinnari.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jumana. And thank you, Vinita, for laying the backdrop to assessment and its importance. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to focus on what Vinita described as the section of assessment for learning, right? Which is essentially centered around what the teacher does inside the classroom. How do we gather this information or evidence about children's learning, right? So I was just looking up, how do people generally view assessment, and you will come across these ideas that you estimate, you get a sense of quality. Assessment is an action or an instance of making a judgment, right? You see a child jumping from a height and oh wow, this child can balance, right? So you get an action, and that's something that helps us make a judgment that this child has good motor skills and is able to balance on 2 feet. In education, like I said earlier, we refer to a several variety of tools that we use to know, to document, to gather this evidence, as Nita was saying, on how the child is progressing, where the child is, what do we do, right? Is the next step, or what is the objective of assessment, is essentially that if the child is able to jump on 2 feet from a certain height, can the child perhaps hop now? Is that the next stage? Or is it something that a child is able to hop with support, but is the child able to then hop without support, right? So how are we using this information that we have for the child to provide more opportunities for the child to progress on that specific domain? So as we know that the aim of anything that we do with young children is to help them develop. That's at the heart of what we do with young children, right? To help them develop holistically across all domains of development. A lot of what I will say is also derived from what the National Curriculum Framework for Foundation Stage released just late last year in 2022 is suggesting, right? That we want to know how the child is, we want the child to develop physically, socially, ethically, cognitively, right? Language and literacy aspects, and aesthetics and cultural aspects. So we want children to develop in all these aspects, and therefore what is the kind of opportunity that we provide children to develop. So if we look at assessment for young children, and like we've said since the beginning of this, that it is a very rapid phase. The phase of early years is extremely rapid. We know that there are several synaptic connections being made. Every opportunity that you give to a child leads to tenfold of what the child is able to do. So the environment that the child gets becomes very, very critical. Every child is developing at a very unique pace and a rate. And therefore, what one child is able to do is very different from what another child may be able to do. So that's something that is important to keep in mind when we look at, even when we are trying to gather information about children. This is a very important consideration to keep in mind, that every child is developing uniquely and every child is growing very rapidly. What we also understand is that it is a source of information, right? It's the evidence that we were talking about. And it has to be essentially embedded in everyday routine of what the child is doing. If the child, like Vinita was saying, is doing diagrams, or is scribbling, or is playing with puzzles, is playing with blocks, right? So each of those routines should tell us something about the child, right? And that's one of the underlying considerations or principles when we look at assessment for young children. Now, what should we not do, right? When we are talking of assessment strategies, that it should not, like we said, it should be embedded in everyday routine, which means that do we do a separate test for the child, right? Do we make the child sing songs aloud just because we want to know whether the child can memorize and sing a song? What is reliable information, right? Is it something that you are giving child in a unique situation, or is it something in an everyday situation, right? So how do you decide that what the child is doing is something which is reliable, the child is repeatedly doing, and we know that if a child is behaving a certain way or is performing a certain way in a certain activity, there is a certain pattern to it, right? So that source of information needs to be reliable, should allow for diversity. So any kind of assessment that we are planning for the child should take care of this uniqueness that every child may have in the classroom, and allow for this diversity among children to be reflected in the way we assess children as well, right? Should enable recording and documentation. So how do we know, how do we gather this data? How do we gather this information or evidence about children? And whatever strategy we used should be such that helps us document, helps the teacher document, right? Should not overly burden the teacher as well. Imagine if you were to do individual assessment for children over and over and over again, what does it do to the larger strategies or larger classroom engagement that the teacher is doing? So it should not be a burden on the teacher where she has to document a lot of data, has to report it in a certain way. At the same time, it is something which happens in the everyday routine. Activities are such which are not specifically designed for conducting a test, but are something which happens in the everyday routine of the teacher and the teaching learning process. Now, how do we assess? What is at the core of assessment for early years? The two key things which will be very critical for a teacher who is doing assessment for learning is to observe children, gather evidence, observe what the child is doing. If the child is playing, it is free play time. How is the child engaging with peers? That tells us something about the child's social abilities, child's agency, child's language, right? Several things happen in a small situation. So observation becomes central to what the teacher, the data or the evidence that the teacher gathers. What are the various kinds of products or artifacts? If the child has done a diagram, or if the child has scribbled something, if a child has made something from clay, has made something from paper, these are artifacts and these are products that children have made, and we should be able to look at that and say, oh yes, this child has drawn neatly, or has the child cut neatly, or has the child rolled the clay very well, and that tells us something about the child's fine motor skills, right? So analyzing these artifacts that children have created is again an essential core of the method, any strategy that we use for early years assessment. So a few recommendations in terms of the strategies that we may use is something which is very widely used and recommended is to use developmental checklists, right? This particular checklist that I have taken here is an example given in the National Curriculum Framework on listening and speaking. So when we are telling stories to children, is a child listening, or is the child just moving around in classroom, right? Is the child able to repeat a poem or a rhyme that we sang, or is able to follow instructions given, short instructions given, is able to respond to questions, right? So these are things that you may see in your everyday routine. However, you will have to plan when you do it. So if it's the first week of every month that you're going to observe children in your classroom, you may take sets of children and conduct these developmental checklists, observe children and see where every child is, right? Uses appropriate vocabulary and speaks complete, right? So it gives a sense of the listening and speaking component of the language and literacy component of development. Similarly, you will have learning outcomes for several of these domains and subdomains and the curricular goals. And how is it that we can use developmental checklists that align to those curricular goals? And how do we assess children alongside? A lot of what we observe children do, children say, children give interesting ideas of when they are engaging or are constantly theorizing about something. So anecdotal records are a great way to gather evidence. A child says that I water plants because I know that plants are living things, and I must water the plants like just the way I need water. Plants also need water. They also feel thirsty, right? So these are anecdotes which will tell us where the child is. If the child is rolling clay and if it becomes very watery and the child says, oh, it's a lot of water and therefore the clay is not, I'm not able to make a snake or I'm not able to make a ball, it is telling us something about the child's thinking about working with material. So anecdotal records is something that a teacher who's alert, who's engaging with every child, who makes note of these instances whenever they are happening, documents it, right? We said that assessment should help us document where children are and how children are developing, and as anecdotal records again become a great way to gather this evidence. Event samples. So as a teacher, I could actually, decide that today in my nature walk, I will want to look at the kind of questions that children are asking, right? Or in the story session, I may want to again look at how children are responding or comprehending the story and the kind of questions they are asking. So I may collect or I may decide certain sessions in my day which become evidence for the kind of language children are developing, or how children are doing their physical motor activities in their free time, in their outdoor play time, right? So these are event samples that I could collect as a teacher, again, to help me plan what I should do with my class on the next day. There's somebody who's not muted. Yeah, there's a lot of background noise. Yeah. The third kind of the fourth kind of assessment that I would think is very critical for a teacher to gather data about children is to analyze these artifacts, like we were saying. Here I have just presented what will suggest to a teacher how the child has developed, right? So there may be scribbles at the beginning of the year, then there can be closed figures, semi-closed figures, and then finally you see neat closed figures from the same child. So this becomes a good artifact for us to see how the child has progressed over the period, right? So portfolios, that is systematic documentation of children's work, gathering them systematically, collecting them in a file, noting when the child had done that work. Again, after 3 months, you collect a certain progress on a similar kind of activity, and then at the end of the year. So each of this gives us a sense of how the child is developing, right? Helps us know where the child was earlier and how the child has moved forward. Self-assessment, like again, Vinita had alluded to that. What do children think about their own learning? Did they like something? Are they able to do it well? What do they think about themselves? So this could be another interesting way for a teacher to know whether the kind of activities or opportunities that the children are getting, is that something that the child really enjoys, engages with, or is it something that the teacher may need to tweak, may need to change to make the child engaged, or to give a similar activity to achieve the same developmental goal, right? So self-assessment by children is again something that has been recommended in the National Curriculum Framework, and I thought it's important that once in a while we keep having children experience and reflect on their own learning, and suggest to the teacher what he or she is liking, right? So what do we do? Like we said, assessment is not paper pencil test assessment. Do we do unit tests, right? Do we do exams? There is a lot of pressure from the parent body, from the school as a body to tell parents how the children are performing. So for early grades, it's extremely essential for the teachers to be confident that these evidences that they collect are in themselves very sufficient, and in fact more insightful for the teacher as well as the parent to know what the child is doing, how the child is developing. It is not the one-off paper pencil test or a worksheet that is given to the teacher, to parent to say, yes, the child is able to write, or as yes, the child is able to do sleeping lines and standing lines and join the dots, right? That's not what we want to know about children. What we want to know about children is how the child is developing across each of these domains. Paper pencil tests have a lot of limitations. They only suggest one kind of learning, right? And that is essentially pincer and their motor grasp and how children are able to articulate themselves in the written word. So this is something that we need to be mindful about when we're looking at assessment for learning, especially in early years. Unit tests, again, if you're looking at quarterly exams or quarterly developmental checklist or quarterly assessment patterns, because you want to see where the child has progressed after you've done a certain content or have introduced new skills. So unit tests need not again be written tests. These can be collection of data, collection of evidence from these specific activities or events that you may be engaging children in. Exams, again, this is something that a formal exam, this is the assessment week, we will assess children today, parents prepare them, make them mug up all kinds of rhymes and stories that they know. That's something a big no, right? We putting stress on children is not going to let them be themselves. Like we said, it should be in their everyday routine. It should not create stress for the children. They should not be a pressure to perform, right? So exam is something which is not recommended. At the same time, whatever the child has done over the year is a good evidence of how the child has developed and progressed over a period of time. So while as a school and as a teacher, it's extremely essential that we know what our children are doing. It is important to keep in mind what we should not do, right? And what is it that can lead to a detrimental effect on children when we pressure them to perform in a certain situation. So finally, what is it that assessment is helping us for, right? And like many of us had said earlier, that it helps us understand where the child is. If you look at this cyclic process that we are eliciting evidence when we are gathering data through various strategies and activities that children are doing, we have a way identified to record that in my preschool, I want to use 3 or 4 kind of assessments, and that becomes a consolidated portfolio or a report at the end of it, right? So we elicit this through various opportunities that we give to children. We analyze and interpret this evidence, right? The process of assessment extremely critical is not to just collect evidences, but to analyze what the child is doing. Is the child not moving? Is the child still not being able to make closed figures at the end of 2 years? Is the child not able to perform or be in groups? Is the child very shy, right? Those are the kind of analysis of evidence and interpretations that we can do. And finally, what do we do in our classroom organization, as a school, as a preschool section? What is it that we do to enable all children achieve their learning goals? So acting upon the evidence is a third critical element of the assessment process. And this will help us in facilitating, bridging this gap, giving those opportunities that are required. And finally, it is only one of the inputs. As teachers, what we see inside classrooms is only one of the input that we get. A lot of what children do at home is also important to bring to the fore to understand how the child is doing. So talking to parents, talking to the caregivers, understanding how is a child remaining shy inside home environments and is extremely shy and anxious in school environments, right? So you need to bring these 2 sets of data to be able to make a judgment about the child and see what kind of inputs do we want to provide in the learning environment to children. So as a process of assessment and the strategies that we use, it should help us broadly achieve these goals of learning when we are working with young children. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say as far as assessment for learning was concerned. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And that was really, really, enlightening. And I think very well, Kinnari has, given us a range of, ways to collect evidence. And she's very well explained and, the range of evidence, what it should not be also, that no unit tests, no exams for young children. And the different ways, and I'm sure everyone's made lists. For me, I've made a lot of lists: anecdotal records, event sampling, self-assessments, portfolios, and she's really well brought that out. And I really like the part in the end where she said, you're gathering evidence, but it's not just to gather evidence, is not what assessment is for. It's about analyzing and interpreting that evidence, and then what's the way forward from there. So what is it that we do? You act upon that evidence for learning. So thank you so much, Kinnari. That was really so much given in such little time and so well. It was really great. Thank you, Kinnari. We'll now move on to something much more different. We've heard about assessment and, for students learning, but there's something called, there's also this whole school assessment that, a lot of, especially when Vinita told us about the system, but what is it and how does the student assessment fit into it? And what does this whole school assessment mean? I think no one better than Nita from Adhyayan to tell us all about it. And what is whole school assessment? What kind of challenges would one face, or is it possible to do it, and who should be doing it? So let's hear a lot about what this whole school assessment is all about from our next speaker, Ms.Nita. So over to you, Ms.Nita.
Thank you so much, Jumana. So we heard a lot about from Vinita and Kinnari how assessment is not a one-time event. So, even though we spoke of the systemic assessment being something like an exam or a test assessment of learning, what we're talking about here is actually assessment should be a process. It should be something that is continuous. And for that, you need to create a culture of assessment. And to create a culture of assessment, it can't be that you are the doer, you are the person conducting the assessments and you are not subject to assessment yourself. Schools are evaluated, but what are they normally evaluated on? I mean, usually when parents or anyone is looking at a school or judging a school, generally the parameters are on how well the children are doing. Now, when I'm here taking the broader lot of schools, I'm not restricting myself to schools that use board exams and pass percentages to talk about how good they are. I'm talking about a broad range of schools. Any school is judged a good school when it is obvious that the children are doing well. But how do we know this? How do we actually pinpoint what it is that what it is that the school is doing well? And what benchmarks are we using? Any kind of assessment needs certain benchmarks, there needs to be a rubric, there needs to be some way of assessing this, that what does good look like, whether it is for the student, for the teacher, or for the school itself. Now, in most countries, they do have processes that schools have to go through. They have, in the UK, they use they have the Ofsted inspectors who keep coming to the school. The US also. And many countries have these systems. In India, we have these systems for our government schools. We don't have them for private schools. But even in government schools, what assessors are generally looking for, while the systems are in place, the policy looks wonderful. Kinnari mentioned the NCF, the NEP. Read them, and they are beautiful documents. The Shala Siddhi framework, which has been created by NEPA, for school assessment, it is a wonderful diagnostic. But how is this being used in our country is a big question mark. When generally a school inspection takes place, what the inspector is looking for is very administrative aspects. Is the midday meal coming to the school? What is the student enrollment? And of course, what is the pass percentage of the school? So they're looking at only those very restricted parameters, whereas the Shala Siddhi framework, which has been developed, looks at schools from all aspects, right? From school governance to teacher development to teaching and learning processes, learner progress, infrastructure of the school. It looks at community participation. it looks at the school very, very holistically. And that is what an assessment of a school should be like. But the problem is that people don't know how to use these frameworks, and that is why government schools are in the condition that they are. Now, what the other aspect of assessment that both Vinita and Kinnari brought out was the fact that it needs to involve the students. It's not something that is happening passively to the student. So even when you're talking about a school review process, it needs to include the voices of all the stakeholders, the views of all the stakeholders. And that is why at Adhyayan, we developed this whole framework of, this whole process called the collaborative school review. And I'm just going to share how this process works. So it is a cyclical process in which you collect evidence using different methods. Just like Vinita and Kinnari showed, various things that we can use, various methods that we can use to assess a child. You can't restrict yourself to just one method or on one day. It has to be something that is triangulated, it is corroborated by different methods. So we use 4 methods of evidence collection, one of which is called the learning walk. When you're walking through the school, this gives you a lot of information about the basic infrastructure of the school, how the school works, how the school looks like on a normal day. Then you have the classroom observations where you can actually see the teaching learning process play out. All this is then corroborated by interactions with stakeholders. And during these interactions, you're talking to students, you're talking to teachers, you're talking to the administrators of the school, the principal, the school leaders, and even alumni of the school. And finally, how does the school document all this? So this is the book look. If you relate it to what we do with students, this is also actually the school creating its own portfolio. Now, the difference between the Adhyayan review and, a lot of international schools have this process where they have to go through assessment, but by the body that has accredited that school. But these are not regular. They happen every 5 years. And from my experience with a lot of IB schools, it becomes like this show you're putting on for the benefit of the assessor team. And it's not something that you're doing because you actually want to grow from the process. It is meant to be something, it is like the school's exam. Am I going to continue being deemed an international school if I go through this process? While the process itself is beautiful, but the spirit in which these kind of evaluations are taken is often, treated as, again, an event, something that we need to prepare for. It should be something that's happening all the time. And that is why these methods of evidence collection can be happening, once you go through a school review, it's actually something that should be continued. You come to judgment after having collected all the evidence, and then you create an action plan. So just like we do goal setting with our students based on where they are and where they need to go, you create your own action plan for what you need to do to improve on certain aspects. You can't improve on everything together. So you strategically decide what is the most important thing. So there are 3 principles that are really important during this kind of assessment. There has to be consistency, which means that whatever you see, whatever you've observed, should be observed in every class throughout the school, that is from kindergarten to grade 12, and throughout the year, not just for the purpose of the assessment. Is there enough evidence that this is a consistent, robust practice? The other aspect that is important is have you triangulated this information? Have you taken the feedback from, have you used at least 3 different methods of evidence collection to get this information? Have you spoken to at least 3 different kind of stakeholders? And have you collected that evidence at 3 different times or situations, at 3 different times of the day, or in 3 different situations? That is also really important. And the other thing is to keep all kinds of supposition away from the process. You base it on actual data. We always tell our assessors that go into the school like a camera. Capture what is happening without saying, oh, this teacher is very good. What did you see? And we don't actually focus on the teachers at all. We focus on what is happening in the classroom. How are the students? The teacher may be, how are the students reacting to what is happening in the classroom? So rather than saying that this teacher is very good, you describe it as a descriptive kind of evidence that the teacher was using hands-on material to explain things, that the students were interacting with each other. There was group work, pair work going on. And those are some of the indicators of great classrooms. So conducting these assessments of the whole school is a sort of a, we go for these annual health checkups. It's almost like that. You need to see the health of the school. You can't, just because a lot of people are coming to your school for admission, is not the best indicator of whether this is a good school. We need to be reflective. We need to grow. And why not go from good to great? So that is the whole idea behind why whole school assessments are really necessary, and how they actually tie into this culture of assessment and reflection that is a must for every school.
Yes, thank you, Ms.Nita. That was, great for us to know about whole school assessment, and the way you've brought out that it's a collaborative process, and it needs to be done with consistency and in collaboration, and you explained very well with different stakeholders, and collecting evidence again from in different ways, at least 3 methods and 3 ways, and and therefore that keeps us away. And I really like the way you said that it's the health of the school and the whole school. So moving on from there, we would like to know more about what kind of data do we collect from these different assessments? And if Ms. Kinnari could also talk, and even Ms.Vinita, if she can, that how do we use this assessment data? I mean, what do we do with all this data, that is this evidence that we are collecting? So Ms. Kinnari did say that, we need to act upon it, and we need to do so. But what exactly do we mean by that? So how well can we use this data? And it could be qualitative, quantitative data. So both in both aspects, how do we make the best use of the data that we collect? If Ms. Kinnari or Ms.Nita, anyone? Ms. Kinnari, would you like to speak?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I look at this process of assessment, and like we just saw how even the curriculum framework is suggesting this cyclical process. I think if any strategy that you use, right, or you use like we've developed something called an early learner assessment tool, which is a developmental tool for several across domains, have a very detailed rubric to go through. Now, what do we do, right, after assessing every child or a sample of children in an Anganwadi center or in a preschool? What is it that we do with this kind of data? So I think at our levels, we can look at it at three kind of levels. One is the immediate, right, at an individual child level. Is this child able to do something, or is the child behaving a certain way, or is the child skilled in a certain way, right? At the child level, it gives us a lot of information. This information feeds back to the teacher of how the teacher responds to the child, what kind of activities she plans, what kind of expectations she may have. Tell parents to observe at home, parents feed in, right? So at child level, it is a very critical data that is available to us. At a classroom, at a whole class level, right? Now, if I know that across in the first quarter, when I'm using a certain kind of rubric or a developmental scale to assess children, I know whether my inputs that I'm planning as a teacher, are they really working for that class, right? Against the learning outcomes that are there. So it's at the teacher level, an aggregation of what happens at a classroom level, right? Is an essential, again, a feedback to the teacher to how her teaching, how her planning is working with every child and the class at large. Similarly, at a school level, now if there were various preschool sections, right, or at a sector level, there are several Anganwadi centers, and they're all expected to follow a similar curriculum given by the state. Now, how are children across these preschools doing? How are children across these preschool settings doing, be it Anganwadi or be it a private sector preschool? So knowing a certain, how are 3-year-olds doing, how are 3.5-year-olds doing, how are 4-year-olds doing? I think we as a society, and we as a community, even an academic community, have very little information about what inputs we give and what are those inputs yielding, right? We are not able to see it at a macro level of what is exactly working. Is it just nutrition that's working, or is it actually these hands-on activity and 2.5 or 3 hour of good preschool time that is working in helping children achieve all the learning outcomes? So getting that aggregation of data at a larger macro level is a third very important aspect of assessing, and assessing systematically, right? At classroom level, you may have anecdotes, you may have portfolios, they're very individualized. But the moment you move to the next level, at the school level or at the macro level across schools or across district, it is important to have a certain kind of assessment and a certain kind of gathering the data, as well as how you use that data, right? And that data is a feedback to us, as in to the system, I would think, to the department, to the board, to the school and the larger community, that we need to give more material to children. We need to invest more instead of just giving a certain amount for teaching learning aids. We need to really give them lots of activities, workbooks, a whole lot of active learning material for the teacher. We need to give more time to the teacher. Those are the kind of data points that we will get when we look at an aggregated level of assessment data that we are able to generate at a larger community level. So that's what I think, that it works at various levels, and different kinds of assessment give different kinds of inputs to different actors or stakeholders in the system.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms.Kinnari. Very well said that, this data can be used at various levels, like for the individual level and classroom level, and the school level, or even societal level, which you've brought out. And it definitely will give us a lot of feedback, and this data can be used to, very well give aggregated feedback also. So once it's aggregated. Over to Ms.Nita, any thoughts on this, on how we can use assessment data?
While Kinnari actually covered most of the ways in which assessment data can be used by the system and by the teacher and the community at large, I'd like to touch upon a little bit about how can students use assessment data to become better learners. So, of course, the moment you give students numbers or a grade, that's again, evaluative, and that does not provide me with data on what I need to do in order to learn better. It just tells me, it puts a value judgment on me, and that's not really helpful. So when I'm talking about data here, I'm talking about data being given to students in a slightly different way. How does the student get insights from the way they have performed in order to figure out what did I do well? How can I use what I learned from this assessment? How can I apply this to other aspects? So for instance, the kind, so for students, the data has to be much more qualitative rather than quantitative. And that comes in the way you frame your feedback. Feedback is, when you just put very good, 5 stars, or, instead of, maybe you're the type of teacher that doesn't put grades and doesn't put numbers. Well done. But even this very good, well explained, what did I explain well? How does that make sense to me as a student? Extremely well organized. Okay, but what did I do, and how can I use that strategy in the future for other work? How might I apply what I have learned in one situation? You know what Vinita started out with, that moving from the known to the unknown, from the concrete to the abstract. How can I apply these strategies to everything I do? So that is the kind of data that is very important for students to get. And like I said, it needs to be qualitative in nature rather than quantitative. Quantitative data can be very disheartening. It feels very evaluative, and rather it needs to be this type of data that will really be helpful for me as a student.
Great. Thank you, Nita, for covering the point about, how qualitative data is essential for a student and, to regulate his or her learning. Ms.Vinita, any thoughts you would like to add, or we can move on to the next question because we are running short of time. If we can just sum up also.
No, I think they have, I think Kinnari and Nita have covered it very well by saying, again, it is like whatever data I'm collecting, who is it for? If it is for the students, it needs to be qualitative. They need to know what they've done well or not, and what is the process they should follow for the next, and what they should do. If it is for the system, it's just numbers, because it cannot be qualitative over there. So again, it's like, who's your audience? For whom are you doing this assessment? Who's the end user, and how is it going to be used? I think the data needs to be collected on that basis, and the tool itself needs to be in accordance with that. So I think they summed it up really well, and I don't think I need to add more to that. Thank you, Kinnari and Nita. Thanks. Yeah. Over to you, Jumana.
Yes. And any recommendations, Ms.Vinita, because, the government, especially in Muktangan, working with government schools, the government has proposed the continuous comprehensive evaluation system. So any recommendations, anything that you would like to give, and how, the way you spoke about the different ways of the strategies of assessment, what are your suggestions? I mean, how does it fit into the continuous comprehensive evaluation that
so again, I'd like to go back to what Nita said, that everything is very nicely presented and all there, but the gaps are always in the implementation. So they have a lot of, like, if a child is in grade 3, there's 70 marks is formative and only 30 is the summative exam paper, so to say. But that 70 formative also has to be marked. So again, it comes down to giving a number instead of being qualitative, so sometimes that becomes quite restrictive itself. But having said that, as a teacher, it's up to you where to take it. There are certain things you need to report for the system, but your entire teaching doesn't have to revolve around that at all. I think the teachers have that autonomy through the year, and I feel if you do your continuous evaluation, your assessment through the year, I think the marks will just follow. There's no way they're not going to follow after that. So even that will happen if this assessment is done well. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Vinita. So any last thoughts, or we can move to questions now, and maybe that way we can get some more. Any questions, Shruti? Do we have any questions?
So a lot of our viewers are also tuning in live. So there is one question in our live chat box from Aritra Sengupta. So she wants to know how these formative assessment strategies can be used in single teacher classrooms, doing multi-grade teaching in government schools, where differentiation needs to be at the specific learning level and grade. So how do we do that in single teacher classrooms in those kinds of settings?
So who would like to take that? Vinita? Would you like
Yeah,
to?
can I say something on that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I think this has always been a struggle about the teacher-child ratio and how do I do quality assessment when I have so many children. But I think if we want to do it, I think putting the children in smaller groups and letting them work on things on their own. It's even how I organize my classroom. If I'm going to do the traditional benches and walk around and the children are just writing, I think working in small groups and the teacher going around and seeing what they're doing, that kind of thing would help a lot in this kind of scenario. But let's not do qualitative assessment because of this. I think we can work around
and
it.
you did give one example of differentiated assessments, you
Right.
know.
So the differentiation, like I said, it can be according to the learning styles of the children or at cognitive levels. So once the teacher has figured that out, if the children are put in those groups, they can have discussions, the teacher can go and see, she can facilitate for a bit, move to the next group. So I think the small groups and doing it that way would help the teacher a lot more. But I do understand the challenges of having many children in the classroom. In this case, even peer assessment is another strategy that can be used, because there are some children who always finish their work first, or they are more clear about concepts or whatever it is. These children can then be paired up with other children, and that peer assessment, peer learning can also be done. Everything does not have to be done by the teacher. She can just be a facilitator and do that. So I think that's another way that the teacher can use in that kind of a classroom, in that kind of scenario.
Yes, so small group learning and peer assessment. And Ms. Kinnari, any thoughts on that? On how one is to many students, and that to multi-level or multi-grade students. And I think for young children, we do have, in Anganwadis, there's a range of children from 3 to even 2, sometimes 2 years to 6 years. So Ms. Kinnari, any thoughts on that?
This is similar to what Vinita said, right? That it's important that you do formative assessment, not as as a fixed kind of an activity. Formative and continuous assessment needs to happen alongside what you're doing. So if you're given a craft activity to children, what is it that I'm trying to observe in that, right? What kind of tool again comes into picture? So in younger grades, you have checklists that can be used. In older grades also you can have checklists. Is the child able to solve a sum independently, or what are the kind of errors that the child is making, right? Looking at children's daily homework, if it is in everyday in the higher grades, could well be a way of assessing children in a continuous formative basis. So you don't have to have a test or like event, right? That this is the formative assessment time of the year, and therefore I have to do X number of unit tests and things like that. It's really how you are continuously observing children, whichever grade the child be in, but how are you continuously observing, and as an alert teacher, again, how are you making notes of what the child is able to do and not able to do. And in older grades also, like Nita was saying, that how the child is understanding the gaps and clarifying those doubts, right? And that's the kind of formative assessment. So I assume that the kind of government level checklists that may be there for CCE and things like that are more again to document the data that the teacher is continuously collecting. It's not to use that as one format where you have to go and conduct like an assessment, and then fill it out. It's not that. It's actually the teacher's observation of this daily classroom teaching learning process and engagement with the child, which needs to be documented in a certain manner, and that's what is referred. So CCE, I think, is we still don't understand it well enough, while we've gone ahead and implemented it at large scale. But what teachers need to do, and it is very hard, it's not easy to work with 20, 25, 30 children in single teacher classrooms. So the teacher has a lot of pressure, but I think they should do away with this pressure. Instead, it is to focus on what you're doing in class and focus on what children are doing in class, and then try and document it. I think this stress of conducting CCE needs to be loosened up a bit, and make it a more natural routine process, and look at CCE assessment as continuous assessment processes.
And I think in your presentation also you said that assessment should not become like a burden for the student and for the teacher. So it should not be viewed as a burden. And I think the mantra that you've given us is, of course, observation and ongoing. So keep that. So it doesn't become like an event. So it's ongoing, it's observation, and observation also has enough this. So you don't really need to, do just observing also lets you know that, where the child is and, what I need to do. Great. Thank you, Kinnari. Nita, any thoughts on,
Just very, I'll
large
just,
platforms?
for the lack of time, I'll just be very
Yeah.
brief. But,
Yeah.
actually, I feel that the bigger problem is not so much the burden on the teacher of teaching and learning. In government schools, at least, the burden is of all the other administrative tasks and all the other silly work that the teacher is asked to do that actually takes away from their time. Otherwise, actually think about it. It's the ideal kind of classroom where you have children are not divided into these grades or anything. You can have peer learning. You can do such beautiful stuff in those classrooms, because children don't learn all children who are 3 years old will not learn exactly the same way. They won't learn exactly the same thing. So you have a lot of scope for doing wonderful things, but unfortunately, all their time is taken away in doing nonsensical tasks like other duties which have nothing to do with teaching and learning. So that is the sad part.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. So the burden is definitely there on them. And if, again, CC itself also becomes a burden, then I think it leads to nowhere. Okay. Any other questions? The participants who are with us on Zoom, and I know Shruti is looking at live also. So any other questions? Anyone can ask a question. We'll take one more question and then we'll go on to end the webinar. Any questions, or we can move on? Do we have any questions from the participants who've joined us? Shruti, any more on YouTube?
No, nothing more on YouTube.
Okay, so then that brings us to the end of the webinar. I'm glad we are almost ending on time. We have 5 minutes. Shruti, you'd like to take some feedback. So if you want, you can put the feedback link. And to sum up, I think we've had a great webinar today. We really actually, understood what assessment means, and its importance in today's scenario that we are in. And also we've got some good strategies on how we can assess children while in the learning process, and make it part of our teaching learning process, rather than looking at it as some event that has to be done. And we've also looked at, it needs to be ongoing, and it needs to, again, be constructive in nature. And it's not only assessment of knowledge, it's also assessment of various skills that can be transferred, skills that will be there for, which a child keeps for his entire learning journey. And and then we also looked at various ways of, assessing developmental assessment of young children in the early childhood, this domain. So all the domains of development and the various ways we can do. And I really like what Kinnari said, the assessment can also be used for comparison, like, what is the assessment of home versus vis-a-vis school. So that was also very interesting, Kinnari, which I found very interesting. We also got from Nita a lot about what is whole school assessment, and that you cannot just be happy saying, oh, my school is getting a lot of enrollments, so I'm fine, I don't need any thing to check the health of my school, or just to get a certification after 5 years. It shouldn't be only that, but it's our responsibility that we keep checking up on the whole school, and it has to be a collaborative process. So we've got a lot of information from all our speakers on how all this assessment data also that we've got, how we can use it, at various individual level, and for feedback at individual level, at classroom level, and the teacher herself also gets feedback, students get the feedback, and if so it helps in moving forward. So it's more feed forward, I should say. And yeah, and I think we've got a lot of food for thought today from our esteemed speakers, and I'd really like to thank each one of you for giving us this time to kind of look into this whole thing of assessment, of for learning, or what assessment is. So thank you so much for being there with us and joining us, and we are hoping that we hear from you more about other topics too eventually. Yeah, so over to you, Shruti, now for the feedback.
Thank you so much, Ms.Jumana, for summarizing this so well. I think this has been such an engaging session. Thank you so much to all of you, Ms.Nita, Ms.Kinnari, Ms.Vinita. There have been so many good points that have come up in this session, right from breaking down what assessment actually is, to the different strategies that can be implemented at all levels, and how I particularly, like the point as to how is this data important for students. All of us being students ourselves, we know what kind of evaluative papers we would just get marks at the end. But I think looking at it differently and looking at how can we become better learners, more reflective, I think that is really, really crucial. And even for educators as well as the overall health of the education system. So thank you once again for being a part of this session. Thank you to our participants for joining on a Saturday afternoon, and or to all our viewers who have joined us live as well. Please do register for our upcoming webinars. We'll keep sharing information. Do follow us on social media, and please stay connected, engage with us. Thank you very much once again. And please do fill up the feedback form. The link is given in the chat box. Thank you so much.